Welcome to Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, we'll be talking with our special guest, Bob Romano. Bob Romano is a decorated author of many books surrounding the experience of fly fishing and a fly fisher's life and observations. Bob was born in the Bronx and has a career practicing law. For the winter months, Bob and his wife Trish live on 12 wooded acres in the Kittanini Mountains of New Jersey. In the summer, they have spent the last 40 years living at the family camp on Aziscahoss Lake in western Maine. That has allowed Bob to enjoy and share his experiences there through his writing. Many outdoor writers concentrate on the how-to aspects of fly fishing. Bob prefers to examine why we fish while using the rivers, lakes, and streams of Maine's Great North Woods as his literary canvas. Bob Romano's most recent book, River Flowers, is a collection of short stories about wild fish, the places that they're found, and the people who seek them out. He is also the author of the Rangeley Lake series of novels, North of Easy, West of Rangeley, and Brook Trout Blues. North of Easy took second place in the 2010 New England Outdoor Writers' Best Book Contest. His latest novel, The River King, is also set in western Maine. Bob's wife Trish often adds artwork and photographs to illustrate her husband's writing. She is an accomplished artist and trained scientific illustrator. The couple's daughter, Emily Rose Romano, has contributed a number of watercolors to her father's most recent book. Bob is a frequent contributor to Maine Boats, Homes, and Harbors magazine and Midcurrent, the online fly fishing magazine, and writes columns for Northwood Sporting Journal and Skylands magazine, while doing his best to keep up with his blog, which can be found at forgottentrout.com. It is my pleasure to introduce today's special guest to the Flyline Podcast audience. Bob, welcome to Flyline Podcast.
Hey, Mike. Good to be here.
Well, Bob, it's great. I mean, I've heard your name. It's a household name in Maine in fishing writing, and I've heard so much about you that it's just a wonderful opportunity to finally have you on the podcast and to try to get to know you a little bit better and allow the audience to do the same. Bob, let's start right from the beginning. I always like to do that if you don't mind. How did you get started in fly fishing, and was there anyone who was influential to you?
Yeah, I'll tell you, my dad was an avid an avid fisherman. Fished with spoons and lures. He was also deadly with worms. And I grew up in the 50s, and I had a spinning rod in my hand all that time. When I went to college, that would be in the 60s, I read Richard Brodigan's Fly Fishing in America, which really had very little to do with fly fishing. But the title caught my attention, and I started reading some books about fly fishing and went out and got a 7-foot Fenwick fiberglass rod and tried my luck. And for the first 2 or 3 years, to be honest, I didn't catch a damn trout. And I would throw it back in my car and get the spinning rod back out, and did that for a while. But eventually caught my first trout, and from then on in, I was hooked on fly fishing. Really didn't have anyone that was around to teach me fly fishing.
Right.
Kind of just learned it on my own.
And has it been that way, or have you ever taken instruction?
No, it's pretty much been that way. I haven't had any instruction at all. I have learned from different guides and other folks that I've met, especially in Maine, who I've just gone fishing with, and you're just going to learn an awful lot by having a buddy out there with you.
Yeah, that's always the case. You learn from the people that you spend time with. Being a guide myself, I always maintain that I'm not a smart person. I'm just experienced because I've been surrounded by a lot of experience. But so I can picture you back in college, Bob. Where were you fishing? Where were you starting out with your pursuits with the fly rod?
Yeah, so I went to school at Villanova in southeast Pennsylvania. So I was actually fishing those southeasterly streams, those chalk streams of southern Pennsylvania. And then when I returned home to suburban New Jersey, I was only an hour and a half away from the Catskills. So I found myself fishing the Beaverkill and a lot of those Catskill streams. And that's pretty much where I learned my fishing, would be in the Catskills. Yeah,
excellent. I know that you wrote an essay called The Christmas Trout, and you talk about fishing up in that area with your father. Could you maybe just give us a narrative interpretation of that story? Because I think it really illuminates a transition we all go through.
Yeah, I mean, that was a fun story to write. So My dad was in the Navy during World War II, and basically a blue collar guy who fought his way into the middle class, coming from the Bronx and moving to suburban New Jersey. And I look back at it now, and my dad's hard work made it available for me to go to Villanova. Well, meanwhile, I'm in Villanova, and my hair is down on my shoulders, and I come back with a fly rod, and he had never seen a fly rod, and he kind of looked at that as if that was an affront to his way of life. It was just one more way that I was kind of getting up on him. I didn't feel that way. But I didn't like my father's politics, so there was a lot of tension there while the Vietnam War was going on. So eventually, we held a truce ourselves, and we went up to the Atrium Lodge on the Beaverkill River, and he's fishing with worms, and I'm fishing with a fly rod. And there was actually a Hendrickson hatch on, and I had no idea what Hendricksons were. I just saw these big bugs on the water. And up until then, I really hadn't caught many trout. And I put on a nice bushy fly, and suddenly I start catching fish. I look down at my dad, and he's kind of using his worms, and he's not doing so well because those trout were looking up. He stopped fishing, and he's got a cigarette in his mouth, and he's got the bill of his hat is down kind of over his brow. And I remember he had a daredevil lure hooked to the brim of that hat. And I decided that he was really angry with me for catching those fish. The way I wrote the story was to say, I'm fishing a stream on Christmas, and I'm thinking about all this. I'm thinking about this particular incident. And suddenly I realized that under the bill of that cap, my dad was smiling. And he was smiling because I was catching fish. And of course, after that weekend, we were father and son again, and love my father dearly. He passed a couple of years back, and in my den where I do my writing, I've got a picture on a wall, and it's of my father with that cap and the daredevil pin, in the. So those are the type of stories that I like to tell, as opposed to, as you said, the how-to sort of work, and that's what fishing can do. They can bring a father and a son together.
It did the same for my family, Bob. I spent hours with my father, and same thing. We started out with worms on the trout streams, and then together we learned how to fly fish. Our neighbor was a fly fisherman, and he taught us how to cast and to tie flies, and ultimately we also had a Penobscot Indian as a neighbor, and he knew a lot about fly fishing, and he would take us up to places to fish around Eustis and whatnot, and we really got better at it with experience. But the great part of the story you just told is that the way that fly fishing builds connections between friends and family, and sometimes it can break down barriers like you just described with the barrier you had between your father and yourself. Now I'm very interested because you cast such a large shadow in Maine. What was your first experience in Maine?
Well, I'm not sure how I discovered Bozebuck Mountain camps back in the mid to late 70s, but somehow my wife and I found ourselves up at the camp for a week. That was back when Tom Rideout was the owner of the camp, and Tom was a hell of a character. I became really good friends with Tom during that week, and we came back the following summer. And at that point, my wife and I were married. We hadn't been married in the first trip. And we were just so taken with kind of that dark, almost foreboding beauty of Western Maine that winter we decided we wanted to buy a camp on the lake. And we couldn't find one that was available. We were going through the listings. So we kind of gave up on that and decided, well, let's check out the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. That's a pretty wild region of the country, and maybe we could find a camp there. And we got in touch with a real estate broker, and we're in her office, which this is in the middle of the winter. Snow's coming down. There's snow drifts everywhere, and we're at her office, which was her living room. and she's serving us hot chocolate. My wife, by the way, was 6, maybe 7 months pregnant with our daughter. And we're going through these listings, and we get through page 7 or 8, and there's a listing for Aziscahas Lake. And I said to the broker, wait a minute, this is in Maine, isn't it? She says, yeah, you don't want to know about that. I'm listing that for a friend of mine, but I've got this great place up the road, blah, blah, blah. I said, no. I said, you just sold us the camp that we want. And we bought that camp on a photograph without seeing it. We signed we put a down payment down, contract, signed the contract, bought this place without ever seeing it because it was on the lake. And that spring, I packed my black lab buck at the time, my wife, and my 6-week old daughter into a Toyota pickup truck, and we drive 9 hours up to Maine to see our new camp. And that was the first time that I saw it, and that was our introduction to the state.
Yeah, and that leads us right into a question that I wasn't going to ask. So tell us about the story of walking into a camp that you bought sight unseen. What was it like opening the door, and what was the first impression? Because sometimes these camps can not be what you originally anticipated.
We lucked out. The folks that we bought it from were really wonderful. They were an elderly couple, and we were just kids, my wife and I. And of course, they're shocked. We walk in with this 6-week-old daughter. I thought the fellow's wife was going to have a heart attack, and they had laid out cold cuts and a bottle of champagne for us, and the cabin was in great shape. It really was. I would have no complaints. I mean, it wasn't anything fancy. The cabins on Aziscahas Lake, none of them have electricity. Basically, plywood would be the interior walls and that sort of thing. We kept that camp for maybe 25 years. We bought it, by the way. It was not on leased land, like as many camps are, but it was in the middle of the lake. And I'm a fly fisherman, so I would either have to drive a half an hour down the logging road to get to the lower McGalloway, or I'd have to drive a half an hour up the logging road to get to the middle section of the McGalloway to do any fly fishing, which was okay for a young man. But about 20 years into it, and the cabin was on a bluff, so you had to walk down a very steep trail to get to the lake. The boat that I had at the time never came up to the cabin, and I would have to haul my outboard up and down, and I'd have to haul my pump that we pump water with up and down this trail. So about 15 years ago, I looked at my wife and I said, how many more years do you think this old man is going to be able to carry this stuff up and down the trail? Maybe it's time we look for another camp. And we lucked out. We found a camp at the top of the lake that just has a nice walk to the lake. It's on a cove facing south, and it's a similar cabin, but it's just easier to maintain. But we have no electricity. We use a generator to pump our water, and we've got gas lights with a propane stove and a propane refrigerator. No internet service, no landline, no cell phone service. About the only communication we have is the radio, and about the only station we get is the CBC out of Montreal. So it's kind of like the living back in the 20s and 30s, and not much has changed.
No, and I'm very jealous hearing you say that, because it's just so wonderful to unplug from the world that we live in today, where technology basically rules our lives, and that must be wonderful for you and Trish to be able to unplug and spend the whole summer. When do you go up there in the spring?
Well, I have to admit I'm part of that May madness. When the smelts are in the river, I want to be on the river too and go after some of those trophy fish. So we usually get up there maybe a few days to a week after ice out, and we'll spend maybe 2 weeks up at camp. We'll stay in camp until the black flies get pretty bad, and then we'll come back home. We like to come back up July 4th week. If I can spend all of August up there, I will, and then the last week of September.
Which is just absolutely gorgeous. If you ever go into Western Maine, second week of September through the second week of October, there's not many people around, or didn't used to be, but the foliage is incredible. The fishing is fantastic, and it's just a great time to be out. There's no bugs, and the fishing is great. So I'd like to talk a little bit about your legal work too, Bob, because I understand that your firm takes on a unique and underserved population. Can you share with the audience the kind of legal work is inspired you to in your firm?
Yeah, I'll tell you, when I started practicing law, as most young attorneys will do, you basically sit in an office and you take on the files that the senior partners give you. So, as an attorney in a small law firm in suburban New Jersey, I was doing drunk driving cases, divorce cases, house closings, and I have to tell you, it just was not satisfying work at all. My grandparents were immigrants from Italy. My parents taught me to respect the less fortunate because but for the grace of God go I. And so after about 10 years in, I created my own law firm, and we represent the elderly, the disabled, and the mentally ill and their caregivers. And that's really all that we do. And I've been able. I don't make a fortune. I'm not a corporate lawyer, but I make a good living, and I'm able to help these folks. And I have to tell you, when my clients come into my office, you can almost see the dark cloud over their heads as they walk in, and their shoulders are slumped. Their eyes are darting around because they don't trust attorneys. And by the time they leave, there's a smile on their face, and I'm able to say, we're going to get you through this. And it's very satisfying work.
Yeah, I know this is unscripted, Bob. Is there any chance that you have, without using names, but can you just share with our audience a kind of, maybe a single experience that you might have had in your career that really made an impact on you? Maybe you helped someone out in a very unique way.
Let's see. We represented 3 retired school teachers, siblings, 2 sisters and a brother, and they never married, and they lived in 2 condominiums. The 2 sister was in one condominium, the brother was next door, and they were elderly, and the brother had dementia and needed to go into a nursing home. And the sisters were fearful as to how they were going to pay for that. We were able to qualify the brother for Medicaid benefits, which the government pays, and that allowed him to go to a quality nursing home. We referred them to a nursing home in the county, and they were able to take care of their brother. When the brother passed away, the one sister, she fell into dementia, and the 2 sisters living together, the sister that was well did not want her sister to go into a nursing home. And so we found a way for those 2 sisters to live together and get care at home, once again through the Medicaid program. When the second sister died, this is maybe a 10 or 15 year period. We represented that third sister when she passed away, and we were able to administer her estate and probate her will, and get her assets over to nieces and nephews and other family members. So I was able to have a history with these 3 people over maybe a 15-year period, and we got to know them pretty well, and we were able to help them with those sort of problems. And that's a pretty typical case. Many times we work with the disabled, and the disabled will have, they're entitled to certain benefits, but they'll lose those benefits if they receive money. So sometimes somebody's on the benefit and they inherit money, or many times they'll be walking across the street and they'll get hit by a car. And some lawyer will bring a lawsuit, and after the lawsuit is over, that lawyer realizes this client's going to lose her benefits because I brought the lawsuit. What do I do? And then they'll come to us, and there are ways to both protect the money by putting it into a special type of trust, and they can keep their benefits. So that's another type of case that we deal with on a pretty regular basis.
So you're doing meaningful legal work. You're doing things that help people out. You're not just trying to cash in on opportunities as they come in. You're actually able to help people out in a meaningful way.
I like to tell folks that we're the good guys in the legal profession. We're 50% social worker and 50% lawyer.
Yeah, well, that's great.
And that's actually, I should say, at law school, I trained to be a social worker. And I was a child care worker for 2 or 3 years. And when I realized that you just can't make any money in social work, and if you want to have a family, and if you're going to be the bread earner, that's a pretty tough way to go. And so I found a way through law kind of to almost be a social worker.
Yeah, and I think also through law, Bob, you figured out a way to become a writer.
Yep, yep. Well, it's kind of a little bit the reverse. So out of college, I wanted to be a writer, but I had absolutely no life experience whatsoever. And God forbid if you ever saw anything I wrote out of college, it was kind of just dribble. So I looked around and decided, well, what could I do? And for an Italian in suburban New Jersey, who went to college, there's only three things you can be, and that's either a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant. Well, every time I added up 2 and 2, it came to 5. I'm a little squeamish around blood, so I said, well, you know what? Lawyers deal with words. They write briefs. That's what I'll do. I'll become a lawyer. And I went to actually law school at night. So I fought my way through 4 years, and that's really how I became a lawyer. Was the next best thing to being a writer.
Do you practice law in other states other than New Jersey, Bob, or are you just in New Jersey?
No, it's only in New Jersey. I'm licensed to practice in New York, but I have a tough enough time figuring out how to practice in New Jersey. I figure I might have better stay with the one state.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Bob, once you were settled in Western Maine, can you share what were some of your first pursuits with the fly rod? Where did you start to kind of bang around back in the 70s?
When I came back to New Jersey before going to Maine, I fished in the Catskills. I fished in Pennsylvania. My wife and I made a few trips up to Nova Scotia, and we fished the rivers and streams of Cape Breton. I even spent 2 weeks in Ireland and fished under the shadows of castles that go back to the 13th century. Caught some brown trout in the stream that John Wayne crossed in the movie A Quiet Man. And they actually have a little sign on the bridge over that stream that says Quiet Man Bridge. That's how I know. But by the time I made it up to Maine, I really was not yet an accomplished fly fisher. And I remember anybody who has fished in Western Maine probably knows the name of Tom Rideout. And Tom owned Bozebuck Mountain Camps. And I remember him looking at my knot from my fly line to my leader. And back then, we didn't have loop-to-loop connections. And he just said, what in God's name is that? I mean, that knot must have, I have no idea what type of knot I used. And so Tom showed me, the proper connection between fly line and leader. And he began to really show me around that area of Western Maine. And he never wanted me to use a guide, even though he was a master Maine guide and he had guides in his service. He would just take a napkin out and he would draw a map and say, you go from this fir tree to this rock to make a turn on this logging road, and you'll end up in a spot that only the Abenaki Indians know about, which of course wasn't true, but the guy from New Jersey took it on faith. So I basically fished up and down the McGalloway River from almost its source, all the way down, past Route 16 and the dam, all the way down almost to the Androscoggin. And that became my playground in the 70s. I fished Upper Dam. I fished the Cosuptic River, the Kennebago River, the Rapid River, all those places with those pools and runs with all those iconic names. And that's where really I was fishing for 70s, 80s, right up until the present time.
Bob, how would you describe the fishing as it was then as to how it is now in terms of, back then the regulations were a lot more open. People were fishing with artificial lures in a lot of the places you just described, but now it's really fly fishing almost exclusively. Do you notice it's getting better or worse, or what's your take on that?
We all know that there's more people now, fishing this area of Maine. There is a greater fishing pressure. But I honestly believe that the fishing is better now. If the fish are larger and the fishing is better now, as far as I'm concerned, than it has been at least since the '70s when I've been fishing. Now maybe that's just because I'm getting better at it,
Right.
but I don't think so. I think that the quality of the fishery has improved. And even with the crowds that we encounter. I mean, in the '70s, when I would fish below Aziscohas Dam in that parking lot there by the hydro tube, if I saw another car parked there, that was too crowded. I mean, I would just get in my car and drive away. If I saw another fisherman, I was annoyed, and obviously that's not the case now. I'm regularly. We have a log at our camp, the 16-inch and over club. So anybody that catches a fish 16 inches or over, you get your name in the log and what fly did you use and whatever. Back in the '70s and '80s, maybe you might catch one or two fish that were 16-inch and over in a period of a couple of days. Now, quite frankly, we're catching them almost every day, and also not only the size of the fish, but we're catching more fish. So something's going on. I couldn't tell you what it is. I don't know why the fishing is better, but that's my sense.
That's really great to hear that, Bob. Now, I can picture you when you first started out. You're probably just working with a dry fly. I mean, can we attribute it to? I mean, what does Bob Romano do when he goes fishing? Do you carry nymphs and streamers and fluorocarbon, or you just stick with on the top?
Well, I tell you what. I think the deadliest pattern that you can use for brook trout or landlocked salmon are wet flies. I almost hesitate to tell you that my go-to pattern. Maybe I won't, but I can use that go-to wet fly, and it's just a matter of depth. And I don't need to use any other fly all season long. I mean, if I wanted to, and I believe I'll catch fish. When I was younger, I would have two rods, one with a sinking a line and one with a dry fly line. I would have a vest with 20 different boxes of flies in it. I'm too old and lazy now, and I use sinking leaders. With the loop-to-loop connection, it's just so easy. I don't even have to remove my fly, so I can use the same wet fly, and once I figure out the depth, I'm good to go. And the other thing that I've discovered, when you're fishing down south, southern New England or New Hampshire, or not so much New Hampshire, but southern New England and the Catskills, it's match to hatch time. And, you may be talking 22s and 24s, and you have to have an absolute perfect drift. You can't have any drag at all. When I'm not in Maine, by the way, I fish the West Branch of the Delaware River. If you want a master's degree in match to hatch, try to catch those fish. But I find that brook trout and landlocked salmon in western Maine, where the hatches are not prolific, it's the action on that wet fly. I can have a dead drift, and all I have to do is give a little twitch of that wet fly, and bam, that fish is gonna hit. And when I do give programs on western Maine, I mean that's one of the pieces of advice that I give to folks is you want to put action on that fly, and sometimes even with a dry fly, which we're all taught with a dry fly, you want a perfect drift. You don't want any drag. I find many times you have no drag at all, and the fish just aren't paying attention. You give that dry fly, even a mayfly pattern, a little twitch, and that brook trout's gonna nail it. So yeah, I fish a lot with wet flies. Of course, I fish with dry flies. And in May, when the smelt are in the water, I'm going to use my streamers like everybody else. And I just discovered a streamer. If anybody's listening, to our podcast, this is the tip I'm going to give them, because this streamer's been around a long time. You probably have heard of Jack Gartside.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Jack was a real character, a fly tire. of renown, and he came up with that soft hackle streamer. And you think I would have known about this as sooner. I really just discovered it a couple of years ago. And I tie one up with, all it is white marabou. Pretty much palmered. Not quite, but it's an easy pattern. You can pick it up on the internet. And boy, I got to tell you, that is a killer fly, a killer streamer in May. I used it last year, and I was stripping it across that pool below Camp 10 Bridge, and I had 3 short takes. Big fish coming up and trying to nail that fly, and I just, to be honest with you, I thought I was going to pee my pants, and I missed all 3. I threw it back in the pool, and I was able to catch one of those large fish. Do you know Celine Dumaine?
Very well.
Yeah. Okay. So Celine happened to be on the bridge. And I'm looking up at the bridge, and I'm married and a very faithful husband, but I see this very attractive woman on the bridge, and she's checking me out, and I'm saying, hey, you know what? For an old man, I must be doing something right. And I go back up, and of course it's Celine, and Celine and I are good friends. And she was laughing, and she said, boy, you put on a pretty good show down there. So I felt pretty good about catching that fish.
And Celine is an incredible fly tyer in her own right.
Yeah, isn't she, though?
Yeah, she's fantastic. She's a great person. And so I think it's great to hear you say that. I'm thinking, Bob, this fly you're describing by Gartside, is it the heron? Is it what the pattern's called?
No. He calls it a soft-hackled streamer.
That's it.
And it's basically, he uses almost a saltwater hook, and he brings that marabou from maybe a quarter down from the eyelet, and you're just bringing it, not really palmering because it's really close, and you just bring it down about to the middle of the hook. There's literally nothing in the back of the hook. It's just a hook. And that's pretty much, he uses a little marabou, I can't think of the name now, a marabou flash. I'm not using the right word.
Crystal flash.
Crystal flash. A couple of lines of crystal flash with that marabou, and then I think he puts maybe a wood dock feather in front. That's it. That's the fly. And anybody can, as I said, you can look it up on the internet. The pattern is there, and I got to tell you, it is a killer fly, killer streamer. It really works well, especially in May, and it probably works great in September too.
Well, Bob, there'll be a million Google searches for this fly after people hear this, because
you know where I heard about it. Come to think of it, I want to give him credit. Lou Zambino talks about that fly in his programs, and he has it in one of his books. That's where I first discovered it, and then I went from there to Jack's website and started tying them up.
Well, I'll definitely look into it and also share it with some of the folks that I fish with. I think that we might be at a good spot to take a break, and what I'd like to do is come back after the break, Bob, and talk to the audience a little bit more about your first experience at the Rapid River, and then I'd like to spend the balance of time talking about your writing.
Sounds good.
This Flyline Flashback is dedicated to the famous Maine fly fishing guide and outdoor legend Herbert Welch. Herbie Welch, the inventor of the still very popular streamer pattern, the Black Ghost, was a Maine guide who gained international status on many important levels. While not as well known as Carrie Stevens, the undisputed mother of the New England streamer, Herbie Welch's impact in Maine outdoor sporting in the region and other contributions are no less significant. Herbie tied his first streamers around the turn of the century, a fact he used as the basis for his claim of being the first person to tie streamer flies. True or not, the statement certainly adds weight to his mythical status. He served an important role in the development of modern-day long-shanked streamer hooks. His initial streamer flies were tied on hooks reshaped from bluefish bait hooks, which he forged into a sleek shape that better served his needs of the smelt patterns he was creating. He recognized the need for long streamer hooks well before there were any commercially available. In many ways, Herb Welch can be considered the father of the New England streamer fly. Herb Welch arrived at nearby Haines Landing in 1903, a skilled guide but not yet the legend he would become. In In a season, he might catch 250 fish, all of which he released. But his fame was secured when he created the Black Ghost streamer fly in the 1920s and guided celebrities like baseball legend Ted Williams and President Herbert Hoover. Herbie Welch resided at Haines Landing and was a true Renaissance man who excelled as a guide, an artist, a taxidermist, a fly caster, and a showman. He was a talented fly caster and set world fly casting records at Madison Square Garden. He also studied art in Paris and New York and sported a 400-plus batting average and a sparkling 937 fielding percentage as a semi-pro shortstop in baseball. It is reported that when asked to name the top 2 flies to use in the region, Herbie named Carrie Stevens' Gray Ghost as number 1, and his own Black Ghost as number 2, not insignificant praise from the inventor of the original streamer. It has been said that Herbert Welch invented the streamer and Carrie Stevens perfected it. Now, on to the second half of our episode. So welcome back from the break. Bob, one question that I didn't ask, but I want to know more about Trish. I think there's got to be a story about how you met her. Tell me how that went.
In New Jersey, young attorneys have an opportunity to clerk for a judge. It's a real coveted position. And I was lucky enough to get that position. So I'm clerking for a judge, which basically means you write the judge's opinion, you sit by the judge's side during court. And I was really blessed to have a judge who was a real human being and treated me like a human being. We would literally have lunch together and talk about everything under the sun. And he was a character, like many of the characters that I write about in Maine. And he was a practical joker. So at the time, we were handling a criminal case, and the jury panel, everybody from the jury room comes in, and the lawyers now have to pick a jury. And so they go through the panel, they pick their jury, and now it's time for the jurors that were not chosen, the 9 jurors who were not chosen, to go back to the jury room. So there's a very attractive blonde, sitting in the first or second row, and my judge says, he's looking at the list, and he says, Miss Troop, would you please stand up? And I could see she's nervous, wondering why is the judge singling her out. And he says, Miss Troop, it's time now for you and the other jurors to go back to the jury room. And I know that this is a very complicated building, and it's important for me that the jurors safely return to the jury room. So, Mr. Romano, would you please stand up? And I stand up. I'm looking at him. I have no idea what he's talking about. And he says, this young man here is a very accomplished attorney. He knows the building inside out. Mr. Romano, would you go down and take Miss Troop's hand? And literally, I don't know what he's saying. I take her hand. He says, now, I want you to escort Miss Troop back to the jury room. Jurors, you're going to follow these 2 young people, and that way I know all's going to be well. All right, so I do this, and I don't know. I probably don't sound it now. I'm an older guy. I have a lot more confidence now. But I was a pretty shy young man, and I don't think I said 2 words to her the whole time. I get back to the courthouse and to the room, and the judge says to me, "How did you make out?" I said, "What do you mean? How did I make out?" I said, "I didn't make out at all. I brought her down to the jury room." He says, "You dummy." He says, "You're just a lost cause." So the next, maybe a week later, that same jury panel comes in. This time, she gets picked as a juror. She's juror number 2. And that was the day I was going to be actually sworn in as a lawyer. Up until then, I had graduated from law school. This was my first job. I have to now go to the capital, Trenton, the capital of the state, to get sworn in. My parents had this big party waiting for me. And I looked at them and said, I can't go to a party. I've got to go back to the courthouse, because the judge wants me there, and it's very important that I be there. And my parents are looking at me very quizzically. So I go running back to the courthouse. I said, this is it. I'm going to get a date. I'm going to ask this juror for a date. And I get back in, and there's nobody there. There's nobody in the courtroom. I go bursting into the judge's chamber. What happened? He says, the guy pled guilty. The case is over. He says, it's too late. You're not going to be, she's gone. And I go running down to the room where the jury panel is located, and she's still there. And I just said to her, "Hey, you know what? I think we should go out for a cup of coffee." And that's how I met my wife. To this day, lawyers that I know, maybe I haven't seen them in a while, and I'll call them and they'll say, "How you doing?" And the first thing they'll say is, they don't say, "How is Trish?" They'll say, "How's juror number 2?" So that's how I met my wife. Has nothing to do with fly fishing. Has nothing to do with Maine.
Well, that's a great story, Bob, about meeting Trish, and you both have struck the lottery. I can tell you. I mean, she's a striking woman, and you're clearly a catch yourself. I know. My friend and our friend Bill Pierce told me a really flowering story about the very first time he met you at the gate at the Rapid River. Can you recount that day?
Oh, I sure can. So I was writing my first book of essays, Shadow in the Stream, and I wanted a chapter on the Rapid River. I wanted to be able to write a little bit about the river itself and Louise Dickinson Rich, who wrote a number of books about her time on the Rapid River with her husband. So Aldro French, who anybody in this region knows is one heck of a character. At the time, he owned the Riches property. And they had a winter house and what they called their winter house and their summer house. And he would rent out the winter house, which was a one-room cabin. And so we had booked a long weekend there. And in order to, if you're going to drive to the Rapid River, you've got to go down a whole bunch of logging roads, and you get to a lock gate. And Aldro was supposed to meet me there, let's say 12 noon or 1 o'clock, and I get there at the appropriate time, and 15 minutes, and I'm there, by the way, with my wife and my 6-year-old daughter, and it was pretty hot out. And I have to admit, I have very little patience, which isn't a good attribute for a fisherman, but there it is. So 15 minutes goes by, a half hour goes by, an hour goes by, and now I'm thinking about how I'm going to murder this guy, Aldro French, who I had only spoke to over the phone at the time. I didn't know him at the time. But how am I going to murder him when he finally shows up? And maybe an hour and a half goes by, and Bill Pierce, who at the time worked for the Warden Service, shows up. I had never met Bill. We subsequently became friends, but at the time I didn't meet him. And he shows up and he kind of smiles at me. He says, what are you folks doing here? And I said, well, I booked some time with this guy, Aldro French, and he hasn't showed up. And Bill just starts chuckling and says, well, but that's Aldro French time. He said, if you wait long enough, he'll show up at the gate. And then I guess he saw the expression on my face and said, hang in there. I got the key to the gate, and I'll bring you down. So we come down, and it turns out Aldro had double booked the winter house. So I can't even get into the place because he's got a sport there, and he's very apologetic. And he says, no big deal. And he tells the sport, come on in, and you'll stay with me in the summer house, which is where he lived, and then we would have use of the winter house. And I'm just thinking to myself, is this the way things work in Maine? I had never experienced anything like that in booking time in hotels and motels and whatnot. Well, it turned out Aldro and I became very, very close friends over the years, and I got to know Bill as well. And I ended up, I don't have it here with me now, but I ended up writing a poem called Waiting for Aldro French out of that experience.
Well, as much as I love the guy, I can tell you that we've all walked down to the winter and the summer house a few times from the gate because it just didn't happen that he remembered to meet us at the time. And he had a calendar, and he would write on paper plates, and we've both witnessed it. He was definitely a colorful character. I felt very honored to be able to go in and spend time with him, not only because of who he was, and he thought very highly of me, and we enjoyed our time together for many years. But naturally, I had the keys to the castle, the Rapid River. We're right there below Lower Dam, and you can pick up the rod, and you're on one of the best native brook trout fisheries in the United States, really. So,
Oh my goodness, yes, yes.
yeah, and I really learned a lot by fishing in there because those fish are tough. And if you
Yep,
think you're going to
yep,
catch one, you better be bringing your A game.
yep.
So, Bob, let's segue into your writing because I think that that's something that really decorates who you are. Uh, you know, when someone who hasn't read any of your work, when they pick up one of your books, now we're not talking about your articles or contributions. We'll talk about that later. When they pick up one of your books, is it a biography? Is it fiction? What have you done?
I want to start by saying a number of my books are now out of print. They went through one and two and sometimes three printings, and they're basically sold out. They're very difficult to find. The newer books are available. But my first book set in Western Maine was Shadows in the Stream, and that was a book of essays, and it really it was I had no idea whether it was going to do any good, whether it would resonate with readers, whether people that live in Maine were going to say, "Who's this guy from New Jersey? Who does he think he is?" Writing about our state. And it ended up going through actually four printings. It's a book of essays, and every chapter was an essay or a story about a different lake, stream, or pond. It brought in a lot of the rich sporting traditions of the region. There would be a chapter on Carrie Stevens. There was a chapter on Louise Dickinson Rich. At the same time as I'd be writing about the actual fishing in the region. And there was even a 10th anniversary edition that Tom Rideout wrote an introduction for. At one of the fly fishing shows, in fact, there was a fly fishing show in Marlborough, and I'm coming down on the elevator from my motel room, and there are these two older gentlemen with the Maine they weren't wardens, but that Maine warden sporting shirt that you can purchase. So I knew they were from Maine, and they flanked me on either side. And one guy looks at the other, and then he looks at me, and he says, "You the guy that wrote the book?" And I had no idea where this guy was coming from, and I said, "Well, which book are you talking about?" He says that book, Shadows something, and I said, "Yep, I'm the guy that wrote it." And he looks at his friend and he says, "Good job." And that's about the best compliment that I could have gotten from two guys from Maine. So that was the first book, this book of essays that's now maybe 15 years since it's been printed. Then I wrote this trio of novels that you had mentioned in the introduction, North of Easy, West of Rangeley, and Brook Trout Blues. And it's basically the Rangeley trilogy, a lot of people call it. And the main character is an Italian-American fly fishing guide. And in the first book, opening chapter, a young woman is traveling through Vermont into New Hampshire and into the town of Rangeley. She's got a black eye, and she's driving a beat-up old car with all her belongings in it. And then it's basically the story of these two people with an interesting cast of characters from the town. And at the time, I set it in the town of Oquassic, which is right outside of Rangeley, but I didn't want to use the name Oquassic. And so I came up with the name Easy, E-A-S-I-E, and the play on words is North of Easy, meaning hard times, difficult times. And of course, people living in the region do have economic difficult times. West of Rangeley takes place 5 or 6 years after the things that happen in North of Easy, and it's when we go into Afghanistan. The first chapter actually is 9/11, and the main character, the fishing guide, Salvatore D'Amico, is actually in a canoe on the Kennebago on this perfect day in September, having no idea what was happening in the rest of the country until he got home that day. And then the third book is Brook Trout Blues, which takes place after the financial meltdown, and how a financial meltdown on Wall Street would affect people in the small town of Rangeley and Oquassic. And at the same time as I'm telling these stories, all the fishing that's taking place, and there's a lot of fishing, is taking places in the pools and the runs that Mike, you certainly would know, and anybody who fishes in the region would know. So it's the real fishing that you would be doing, and the flies that they're using, and the type of techniques they're using is all brought into the novels at the same time. The two books that are presently out are The River King and River Flowers. So those first three novels were basically older folks. The characters were people anywhere from your age, I guess, up to my age. A few young people, but mostly older characters. And I had wanted to write a book from the viewpoint of 20-somethings. How would I have felt if I was a 20-something and I grew up in Rangeley, and my mother and father had to be working two jobs just to barely make a living? So I came up with four kind of tough blue-collar kids in their 20s. And the lead character has aspirations of being a fly fishing guide. And his best friend is probably the best angler in the region. He also happens to be a drug dealer. The third kid is developmentally disabled, but his friends take care of him. And the fourth kid is the woman, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, but kind of the description of Thelma Louise is when Harry says to his friend Gilroy, Thelma was the first girl I ever went to bed with. And Gilroy looks at him and says, yeah, Harry, but half the town can say that. So these are four, I said I can get in trouble for that, but these are four tough blue-collar kids. And how would they feel, quite frankly, when people like me, who have a little bit of money, are coming up to their region and are able to enjoy, that vast playground of Western Maine, when, as I said, these kids can barely make it by, economically. And they know that they're not going anywhere. And Thelma Louise in the book, every week she comes up with a different scheme to get the hell out. One day she wants to be a beauty queen. The next day she wants to be a TV broadcaster. The next day she wants to be a hairstylist to the rich and famous, and just get out. And Gilroy, of course, is a drug dealer. Figures he's going to make his money that way. And the kid Harry, who wants to be a fly fishing guide, and loves Thelma, never wants to leave because he loves the water. And Gilroy just hates people from away because when he was when he was younger, he was into this biggest fish he had thought he was ever going to catch, and two fellas from away up on Parmacini who have one of those camps up there basically said, hey, you shouldn't be up here, son. You don't have a camp. And they distract him and he loses the fish. And from that day on, he's got a grudge against other fishermen from away. So that's the story of the River King. And the question, I guess, is who is the River King? Is it that big fish that Gilroy spends his life trying to catch? Or is it Gilroy himself, who's one of the best fishermen around? And readers got to figure that out for himself. But the latest book, which I think is my best writing, is River Flowers, and it's a collection of short stories, as you said, I think in the intro, about wild fish, the places they're found, and the men and women who seek them out.
Right.
I always thought in a naive sort of way, if you're a fly fisherman, we're all the same. And we're all good guys and good gals because we're fly fishermen. Well, you know what? That ain't the case. We are all different people, and we come from fly fishing from different angles and for different reasons. And I will say that if you fly fish and you've done it for any extent of time, it is going to have an effect on your life. But all our lives are different. So in River Flowers, I'll tell a story about a warden. I'll tell a story about an owner of a fishing lodge. I'll tell a story from a sports perspective. I tell a story from the wife of the guide or the wife of the lodge. I'll tell a story about a poacher, and on and on and on, and all how fly fishing affects the lives of all these people. I once gave a program on writing, and in that program, I tried to explain most artists. And I'm talking about graphic artists, painters, whatnot, especially the great painters. They may paint the same scene over and over and over and over again, and they're coming at it when the light is different, and they're coming at it just to get that scene perfect, and they may never get it perfect. And I don't know about other writers, but I tend to have probably no more than 3 or 4 themes, and I approach those themes over and over and over again. One of the themes is getting older, and not being able to fish in that lower section of the Megalloway below the bridge any longer, because that current's going to knock the angler off his feet. But how can we still fish, and what do we get out of small stream fishing that we don't get out of large stream fishing? So a lot of these themes I've explored throughout this book of short stories. And my daughter Emily Rose, who's an accomplished artist, she did the cover, and she gave I want to say 8 or 9 watercolors that illustrate that collection of short stories. If we've got a minute, I'd like to tell you a story which doesn't appear in the collection, but it's a story that's based upon our daughter. I don't know if we have time to do that or not.
Well, I just want to make a point, Bob, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Had one of the people that really had an impression on me is also a guide, a little older than I, and he said, one of the best characteristics about being a good guide is knowing when to shut your mouth. And I think I've done a really good job here the last 10 or 15 minutes of letting you explain everything. But before you tell the Emily story, I just want to do a quick throwback. When you were talking about River King and you were describing the 4 characters in the Rangeley area, I could put a real life name to each one of those people. The great angler who's poor, who's just a phenomenal, kind of like the Brad Pitt character on A River Runs Through It, who can catch every fish and does it with grace. And then the drug dealer, Maine has got that all over the place, but especially in that area you see a lot of it. And then, of course, the gal and whatnot. But to that point, what I picked up from that, Bob, is you've actually grown to really become connected with that community. You're not just hiding away in your cabin. You've actually been able to integrate with the people in that area to get a sense of the fabric that makes up their lives.
I'd like to think so. People from away, down here in New Jersey will often say, "Oh, those people from New England, they're kind of cold, and how do you get along with them and all?" And my feeling is, you show folks with respect, and they're going to respect you, and that's true whether it's the fella that is fixing my Cervelle refrigerator, turning it upside down and shaking it for me because it's not working, or the guy that may repair my roof, if it's leaking, the fishing guide, the guy in the gas station, or wherever. And that's the way I've always lived my life. And yeah, I've gotten to know an awful lot of people in Rangeley and Oquassic, and again, not just the fishing guides and the guys in the fly fishing store, but the guy in the supermarket, the guy in the gas station, the handyman or whatever. And I realize that most of the folks up there, they literally need 2 jobs. And a lot of those folks you never really you never see. I mean, they're there, and yes, I see them and I relate with them. But most people from away that are on vacation, they don't see those people. They walk right by them. They don't notice them at all. It's a tough living. It's a tough way to make a living. It's a tough way to get by. And so that was something I really, really wanted to write about, and I guess celebrate to a certain extent.
I think you did. I think you've done it, Bob, for sure. Now let's go back to Emily because I think that there was something you wanted to talk about there. I think if you would, I'd like to have you decorate who Trish and Emily are in terms of their artwork. I mean, you just explained a little bit about Emily and her talent level, and she works with watercolors. Tell me about Trish's background and Emily's background with a little more detail.
So the women in Trish's family, going back generations, were untrained or uneducated artists. They just had the artist gene. She's got a great aunt who we've got her artwork, and it looks like the Grandma Moses type of artwork. Her mother is a marvelous artist. Never took a lesson in her life. Trish was trained as a scientific illustrator, and again has the artist's gene. Emily, our daughter Emily Rose, went on partial scholarship, went to the Maryland Institute College of Art. From there, she spent time abroad in Europe, traveled in Europe, and now she is the creative director for a major advertising agency in Texas, and really is a wonderful artist. I mean, she's really what ultimately got me into writing, because when she was a youngster, she would show us something and say, "Oh, here's a chapter from my book," and would say chapter 16, and it would be a full-blown chapter, and we'd say, "What book is this?" And it was a book in her head, and she would think it through, and then just decide, well, I'm going to put one of these chapters on paper. And you'd read the thing, and it really wouldn't need any editing. So she had both the writing gene and she had the art gene. And I said to my wife, having spent time in Maine, I now have this wonderful backdrop and I've got some stories to tell. If I can get a book published, our daughter can see how it's done. And wouldn't that be great? And I remember when I went for my first book signing, I think 3 people showed up. My daughter was there with me and smiled and said, "Dad, when I publish my first book, it'll be in Barnes and Noble, and they're going to be around the block." And I said, God bless you. I can retire early. Let's hope that happens. But she was really the impetus for me to start writing. But any event, when she was younger and she had a Facebook page. My wife and I live on I know we live in New Jersey, and people think of the New Jersey Turnpike when they think of New Jersey, but the northwest corner of the state is very rural. And we've got a little Cape Cod house on 12 acres of land. It really is a little homestead. And when my daughter was young, we looked at her homepage, Facebook page, and what does she say on it? I guess at this time she was about 18, 19, and she says, "Oh, when I was younger and living with my parents, it was like living with 2 hobbits in the Shire." I took that as a compliment. I'm not sure if she meant it that way, but having said that, I now want to get back at her by telling you this story. So I want to say about a year after we purchased our cabin, it's early May, a couple of weeks after ice out. It's probably 48 degrees, and this was our second year at our camp. Our daughter is maybe one and a half, and I say to my wife, "I'm telling you, the salmon are moving in the lake. We've got to get out there." And we had a 16-inch square stern Grumman with a 5 horsepower engine on the back. So she puts Emily, a year and a half, in a red snowsuit. Emily looks like the Michelin Man. And we put her in the bow, and we've got this 100-pound black lab, Buck, and Buck is not in the bow. She's amidships, and Buck is behind her and kind of keeping her warm. And I'm in the stern working the engine, and Trish is in the bow, and we're trolling streamers. And about the same time, we both have salmon. We both get a hit at the same time, and just about then, it starts to snow and hail and rain all at the same time. And I look at my wife and she looks at me, and we're trying to figure, well, who's going to give up on the fish and protect our daughter from the rain. My wife just leans over and gives me the fly rod, and with her other hand takes a plastic garbage bag out of her knapsack, cuts a hole in the top, throws it over our daughter, picks up the rod again, catches the fish, and our daughter is just sitting there bobbing up and down in a garbage bag with the rain coming down. So I don't know if that means my wife is a good mother, but it certainly means she's a good angler. And that's what our daughter had to put up with for, 18, 20 years until she moved to Texas. So that's my story about our daughter.
That's a wonderful story, Bob. I appreciate you sharing it. It's funny. You're a funny guy. Well, so the other thing that people don't know about you, Bob, because that's really what the podcast is about, is to kind of unfold who Bob Romano is. You do a lot of writing with magazines, like Maine Boats, Homes, and Harbors magazine. I'm a big fan of them. I do read a lot of issues of it and have over the years. Do you know Peter Bass at all? Do you recognize that name?
I know Pete from the magazine. I never met him.
Yeah, he's a great guy. I've known him for a while now, and he's always been a big fan, and I'm a big fan of his.
It's a pretty great magazine, don't you think?
Well, it's
an
really
awfully good magazine.
What it does is it does something really unique. It brings something for everybody. I mean, naturally, it's about, you have to have some interest in nautical, and if you're in Maine, you have an interest in either the ocean or the lakes, so they take that tangent, and then they just they do a great job with bringing people like you aboard to kind of create a really nice tapestry of what what's going on maybe behind the scenes.
Yeah, I've been doing their spring issue now. I guess the last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing at least one article each spring, and I really like working with them. They're real professionals. Not all the magazines necessarily are, but they do an awfully good job.
Yeah, that's true. So, you, just for the audience's sake, I did introduce you. You do some writing for some other publications. Just share with us what you've been doing over your career.
Yeah, Mid Current, which is a fly fishing online fly fishing magazine. I write pretty extensively for them. I mean, maybe once a month they'll publish an article of mine. And the Northwood Sporting Journal. I write a monthly column for them. Trish will, in these all my magazine work, Trish will provide either artwork or photographs. So we work together on that. But there are a couple of smaller magazines that now and then I'll give them an article, and then I guess I have my blog, which is free, and that's forgottentrout.wordpress.com, or you can just go to my website.
Which is really good, Bob. I think you're doing a great job. I think you're kind of self-critical about not keeping up on it, but I read it or read some of it, and I think it's wonderful writing. And if that's reflective of your books, then the blog is very well. It's polished, so I think anyone should check that out. And but Bob, we have taken a lot of time, but I feel like we've also accomplished a lot. We've been able to uncover who you are as a person. We've been able to have you tell some great stories, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us, because I'm trying to make this a successful podcast, and I believe that you've done a great job to enhance it. And so thank you for your time.
Well, look, I appreciate the kind words, and I thank you for letting me kind of speak with your audience. It's been a lot of fun, and maybe we'll do it again.
We will, Bob. Thank you for your time.
All right, take care.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion, and thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. A new Flyline Podcast episode will be released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones. Flyline Podcast is a product of Riverside FM.